Great. Yeah, that's good. Well, first of all, can you explain what exactly Sandline International is and what you do in it?
Sandline is a company that provides military consultancy services for governments or large corporations in the commercial security field. And we provide a range of services which cover the spectrum from straight consultancy. They have a problem, they'd ask us to analyse it as an independent group of experts, and we produce a report with a number of options which they may or may choose to take up. We can then implement that for them if they wish, and it can range across a whole spectrum of military problems. I mean, ranging from the size of the defence budget right the way through to military training. We can conduct training. We can provide equipment, but that's not really our core business. If we provide equipment, it's usually contract related. And we can conduct specialist support for governments that don't have the skills that they may wish to have in their military.
What do you mean by specialist support?
We can provide specialists to assist with specific projects, technicians, pilots, electronic equipment operators. And because we tend to operate in third world countries, they're countries that don't necessarily have those sort of assets in their inventory, or have them but are not maximising the use of them, and therefore we'd help them to do that.
And when you went to meet in the case of Papua New Guinea, what was it that you were suggesting there?
Do you mean from the beginning of
yes, I mean in the first instance.
Yeah. Well, they actually came to us. We didn't go to them. They came to us and asked whether we could assist specifically with helicopter support, the provision of helicopters and pilots and the maintenance services that go with them. Because if you've looked at the whole history of Papua New Guinea and Bougainville, I think the biggest issue, other than the conflict itself, is their ability to conduct military operations using helicopters. And in that environment, helicopters are essential. And they had had a number of problems procuring them. The Australian government had given them some, but put a caveat on their use. They tried to procure them from the Americans under the old military equipment system, and that had been blocked, and they needed the helicopters. So that's how it started. But quite often when we are approached by a client, it's not really clear what they want, and we try and help them decide how best to solve a particular problem. And then from that, it developed into a proposal to assist them with the whole Bougainville problem.
And so what was you say to assist them with the whole Bougainville problem, what was the actual sort of military operation that you were suggesting to them to crack the problem?
Well, the period of this negotiation of this contract and the discussion of our involvement with the government and the Bougainville problem took a year. And by the end of the year, we were in a position where we had suggested a number of options to the government, one of which had been accepted, and it's common knowledge that we were going to train their special force unit, which was very embryonic, provide helicopters and specialist equipment in order for them to be able to carry out military operations in Bougainville in a way that they hadn't been able to do to date over the 9-year history of the conflict. The purpose of the operation was to turn the tables on the BRA, not to defeat them in detail in the field, because that would be a very tall order and not really possible in the short term in terms of a complete military defeat. And actually in some ways that would have been counterproductive, because actually the purpose was to get them into a position, or to provide the government with the ability to force them to the negotiating table. Because if you look at the history of the Bougainville conflict, just about every possible combination of settlement or solution had been tried, from the straight military option to the straight peace discussions, and they'd all failed. And they'd failed through a series of successive governments. So really, this was the sort of, I think the sort of exasperation of the Defence Force and the government of Papua New Guinea to try something that could resolve this. And the intention of our planning was to help the PNGDF, because it was their campaign, if you like. It wasn't ours. We were there to support them, to assist them, to provide advice, and to provide specialists. to put them in a position where they could force the BRA to come to the negotiating table, and thereafter produce a lasting solution.
And what was Executive Outcomes' role going to be in this?
Executive Outcomes provided a large part of the manpower. Our relationship, the relationship between Sandline and Executive Outcomes is one of contractor and subcontractor. They are a separate company from us, and if we feel it's appropriate to use their specific skills in a particular task, we'll do so. We think they're extremely good, they're extremely professional, they've got a very good track record. There are no skeletons in their cupboard, as it were. I mean, we think that they have a very good human rights record, and we would use them. And in this case, we were using them because they had the right set of skills and the right group of people to assist in part of the project. Executive Outcomes personnel weren't used exclusively, but they provided the large part of the manpower.
When you say they have the right set of skills, what are you referring to there?
Well, we had to do a number of things. I mean, people have focused on the training of the Special Forces Unit, and they are good at training people in those particular skills required of Special Forces troops operating in a hostile environment like the jungle. And they're very good at it. They have a lot of experience. A lot of their personnel have been doing it for an awful long time, and they're one of the best groups of people I've seen at it. We also had to train on a more basic level some of the ordinary soldiers in the Papua New Guinea Defence Force, and this has been overlooked, I think, in most of the discussion of this, in how to fire mortars, coordinate mortar fire, and some of the more normal basic skills that you would teach ordinary soldiers as opposed to Special Forces soldiers. So they did that as well. And again, they've got the expertise, but not exclusively. Other people would have done that.
And what was the role of of mineral concessions or mineral rights in your negotiations with the government?
None at all, really. I mean, the contract, which I think just about everybody who's interested in this subject has read ad nauseum, is very clear. This was for a specific number of people, items of equipment over a period of time for a certain amount of money. And there was no question of mineral rights being part of the contract deal.
Well, but on the first meeting that you had with the PNG people, I mean, mineral concessions certainly were mentioned at that meeting, as indeed was the name of Executive Outcomes. So I
don't recall that mineral concessions specifically were discussed at the first meeting in Cairns. Executive Outcomes certainly were, because we're quite open about our relationship with them and what they're good at. I don't remember there being any discussion of mineral concessions.
Well,
subsequently, and it's very clear from the Commission of Inquiry and the evidence that I gave and discussions during that there was discussion about mineral concessions. Now, the whole discussion of mineral concessions revolved around trying to help the government. Initially, during this protracted negotiation period, the government was having difficulty, I think, working out how they were going to afford to pay for this sort of operation. And you can see from the final contract, it's not cheap. And although they had plenty of money, I think it was rather difficult for them to unlock it from various different projects. And while they were getting over those difficulties, it was suggested to them that one way of assisting with this is by bringing in foreign investors who, in exchange for mineral concessions, would invest in the country and provide revenue for the government. And therefore they could use that to bolster their national revenue and be able to pay for things such as this. But there was never any question of we'll come and do this in exchange for a mineral concession. I mean, Sandline is a pretty embryonic company, and you will see from the costings, and I'm sure you've read the contract and looked at the costing schedule, that this is an expensive business. I mean, you have to buy the equipment, you have to pay for it up front, you have to pay effectively cash for it. You've got to pay the soldiers and the technicians from the day they start the project. And it's a very cash-intensive business, and therefore, to us, a mineral concession is useless.
But there was linkage, wasn't there, between the fact that there were valuable mineral rights or mineral resources in this country and the fact that you wanted to get this contract that they would have to spend a large amount of money on. Because from the very first meeting which you and Tony Buckingham went to, it was clear that mineral concessions were in the air.
No, I think, as I've said, the discussion of mineral concessions revolved around assisting them to attract investment. I mean, of course, Papua New Guinea is loaded with natural resources. And it is common sense to try and help a country to develop those resources. But as I've said, it wasn't part of the Sandline deal. People have made quite a lot out of the question of the Panguna mine being at the centre of this whole saga. And I think what people fail to understand is that the Panguna mine was the cause of this problem. Right or wrong, that was the way it started. And had become a symbol of the BRA's support, if you like, the indigenous support the BRA had. I mean, for example, the BRA headquarters was on top of the Panguna mine. And it was one of those central issues that couldn't be ignored. Now, that's not to say that the purpose of us going there was to recapture the mine in order for us or somebody else to develop it. The purpose was to, as I've said, to bring the BRA to the negotiating table. But implicit in that, in some form of solution, long-lasting solution, is solving the original problem. So you have to do something about the Panguna mine because it is the major source of income for not only Bougainville, but a major source of income for the government. And you have to address the grievances of the people of Bougainville, not specifically the BRA, but the people of Bougainville, because they felt that their land had been stolen from them, they didn't get a fair deal, their rivers had been polluted, their livelihood had been destroyed, etc. And it had to form part of the solution. And I was always very clear about that with the government. You've got to address this problem on the long-term political, economic development of what you've achieved militarily and subsequently politically. Now, setting that aside, in terms of a military objective, it was considered as one of the options, and people have said it was the only option. I know General Singarok has said that they were trying to force me to go for the mine. That's totally untrue. We presented him with a number of military options, one of which involved a coup de main operation to seize the mine because it was the enemy's centre of gravity and was at the heart of the problem, and may have been the seizing and holding of the mine and developing of operations from it may have been something of value in turning the tables militarily and psychologically on the BRA. But it was only one of several.
But you did yourself, in a briefing paper to the Prime Minister, suggest the possibility that Branch Energy would take over the mine, didn't you?
I did, but I mean, I could have equally said any other mining company. I mean, the point was, I think, of that briefing paper was to make the point to Sir Julius that something had to be done once we had achieved what he'd asked us to achieve. Now, whether it is developing the mine in the short, medium or long term, or providing a agricultural reform program, or whatever it is that the government ought to be doing, that was one option. I mean, Branch Energy was the name I used. I could have used RTZ, I could have used BRI.
Well, you did use RTZ on one occasion, didn't you? Suggested a joint venture with RTZ.
Yes, I mean, I've explained that. I mean, that was in a letter in about the middle of last year. But that was related to trying to illustrate to them that there are other ways of providing the funds in order to do this.
Had you had talks with RTZ when you made that suggestion?
No. I mean, I didn't make the suggestion, I don't think, but it was an idea. I mean, RTZ are obviously involved in the Panguna mine, and therefore logic says you ought to talk to the people that actually own it.
So the sense that one has here, which obviously comes across very strongly in the Andrews report, is that there was always some interest on your side, and you and Tony Buckingham, because the pair of you went there together. There was always some interest in the mineral concessions there, and there was a sense that there was some sort of linkage. Are you saying that conclusion that Andrews draws is erroneous?
From what I've read in his report, he didn't actually make that particular connection directly. I think he referred to the fact that there was a discussion of mineral concessions throughout the negotiation period, and as I've explained to you, it was unrelated to the straight Sandline contract. And seemed to be a sensible thing to do to help a government who had spent millions on this war, A, to recover some of the costs of it for themselves, and perhaps to fund the political or social programs or economic programs that they wanted to put in place afterwards, and to generate revenue for the country.
Now, you mentioned that your relationship with Executive Outcomes is one of contractor and subcontractor. Is it? I mean, you've worked with them before. I mean, not you personally, but I know that your company was before because you said in your evidence that was the case. Is this more really of a joint venture that you have with them in these circumstances?
No. I think I've explained the relationship that we have. It's very clear. They're one company. They're a South African company. We're a company registered elsewhere. We are two totally separate entities. Yes, I know them all extremely well. They're friends of mine. And as I've said, I would use them. They're good at what they do. And it is not one organisation pretending to be two. It is two separate companies. They do their own business. We do our own business. And occasionally we coincide and we work very happily together. And in the case of a specific contract, yes, it could be a joint venture. You could describe it as that. I describe it as contractor and subcontractor.
And again, one of the issues, I mean, I don't doubt for a moment they're completely separate companies. I don't want to get obsessed with who owns the shares of these two separate companies. And one of the issues that draw the attention, Andrew's attention, was the fact that the bank account, your bank account, Sandline's bank account, the signatories on that, into which this $18 million was paid, two of the signatories were Executive Outcomes people and two of the signatories were Sandline people.
I think that if you want to be very accurate about that, at the time of the Sandline contract that was not the case. And I think, as far as I'm aware, but I'm not an expert on the sort of financial and business side of this and how it works, a company was set up, a shell company, with a bank account, and I forget the name of it, on which those four people were signatories. Once it was developed as Sandline, it had to be very clear that Sandline was a separate, entirely independent entity, and those signatures were not the signing authority for Sandline at the time of our contract.
So just to be clear, it says categorically that the bank account into which this money was paid, which was in the name of Sandline Holdings, I think, that the signatories on that were Eben Barlow, Lutig, Buckingham, and Mr. Grumberg. You're saying that that was not in Sandline account?
Not at the time of this contract, the signing of this contract with the government of Papua New Guinea, or during the period of the Andrews inquiry.
So
that is.
So that wasn't your bank account that this money was paid into, then, in other words?
No. What I'm saying is, I think the question you asked me was, were those four people the signatories on the Sandline bank account? The answer to that question is no.
So he's wrong on that?
He's wrong.
So the Sandline itself, you said to him you weren't absolutely sure who owned Sandline, and he seemed a bit, as you seem to know, seemed a bit suspicious. I mean, surprised by that reply. Who does own Sandline?
It's owned by a company called Adson Holdings.
But the ultimate beneficiary, owner of that, is, one must assume, is associated with Mr. Buckingham, and he's the chairman, chief executive of Sandline, isn't he?
He's not, no.
He's not.
No.
He was. It was.
Tony Buckingham's got very little to do with Sandline, other than the fact that he is a friend of mine and has provided a degree of advice and impetus and to develop this company. I mean, I think, again, I made it clear in the Andrews inquiry that Sandline emerged out of something that was a fairly loose and flexible organisation. It didn't really have a corporate structure. And it is no secret that Tony Buckingham had introduced executive outcomes to a number of governments in his capacity as an international investor. And his relationship with Sandline is just one of encouragement, because he thought this is a very valid direction in which to move.
You did describe him, though, as the reason why I thought he was your chairmanship. You described him as such in one of your letters to the people in Papua New Guinea. That's why I thought he was the chief executive.
I think, I don't know which letter you're referring to, but I suspect it was not a Sandline letter, and it was probably written before Sandline had been formally structured.
So, I mean, it was actually on the 16th of July 1996 to the Prime Minister that you described him as chairman and chief executive. So, but you're saying that wasn't...
It was inaccurate.
It was inaccurate then?
Yeah, it was wrong. I mean, he's not the chairman.
So he's not the ultimate owner of Sandline, who is?
I told you a company called Adson
Yeah, but I
Holdings.
mean, who owns that?
And I'm not prepared to comment any further on this.
It's,
you know,
why is it a mystery? I mean, I genuinely don't understand why it's a mystery.
because people who support any type of business, who wish to maintain their confidentiality or discreet involvement in a particular thing, choose not to advertise their ownership or whatever. And it's not really for me to comment on whether it's right or wrong or whatever. That is a fact.
Can I just go back to something about executive outcomes? You said, that it was, and you say, in fact, to Andrews, that I think that you consider it was the best outfit in the world. I mean, this is a company which, in its operations in Angola, certainly, very serious accusations have been made by Angolan civilians about the way that executive outcomes behaved there in 1994.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that doesn't sound like, the best outfit in the world.
As far as I'm concerned, there are no... there may be allegations about executive outcomes behaviour in certain countries, but as far as I'm aware, there is absolutely nothing to substantiate any of these comments at all.
These are, eyewitnesses who were there when, the markets of civilians were bombed, when people in helicopter gunships shot civilians running across fields. I mean,
well, I'm not going to get into a discussion about that because I wasn't there and I can't comment. I can't comment on a specific situation that I wasn't involved in. But as far as I'm concerned, in all my, if you like, due diligence about executive outcomes, I'm very happy with their professional capability and their human rights record and their respect for the laws of armed conflict, the laws of any country they operate in, and indeed the sort of customs of the country. And they're very sensitive about that. And I personally don't believe any of those reports.
So, the civilians that tell these stories now, you think of what made them up? Or?
I don't know. It's not something I wish to debate particularly because I wasn't there. It's a few years ago. I have no way of commenting. All I'm saying is, all I can comment to you on about executive outcomes is what I understand to be their capability and their modus operandi. And I'm saying I personally don't believe them. And
that's, so you know nothing about Angola, but Sierra Leone, where you do know something
yes.
about that, that's an example of where you quote of an example of how professional they are and how good they are.
Yeah, and I think that again, in my examination of their capabilities, there is a lot on public record of how good they were, both professionally and how they helped develop a situation which was, A, militarily extremely dangerous, and secondly, very unpleasant in a country, and assisted with the transition from a military government to a democratic government. And in doing so, were instrumental in helping a number of aid agencies, NGOs, etc., to go about their business in a way that they should be allowed to, without interference from a very unpleasant rebel regime. And I think there is enough testimony from independent organisations. I can't quote you them, but I think CARE and ICRC are two of them, that say that their performance across the board was exemplary. And I believe to be the case.
But it didn't solve the problem with Sierra. That's the, within a very short period of time, Sierra Leone back where it started.
I don't think you can point the finger at executive outcomes for that. I think executive outcomes did an extremely good job. And at a time where something had developed in the country that everybody thought was very beneficial, the RUF had been pushed into a corner of the country and almost defeated, and a democratically elected government had been brought in almost against all odds. And if you think about the circumstances, there was a situation where military advice to the government of the day was, in order to be able to develop the democracy of this country and have peace in the country and disarm all these thousands of armed people and get rid of the child soldiers and put the place back into a civilized state, you should defeat the RUF. Now, that I see as the role of companies like Sandline and Executive Outcomes, to provide that sort of advice. But we're not in the business of forcing ourselves on client governments. If they choose to ignore it, that's up to them. It was our judgment that these guys would be back with a vengeance, or that because the problem of the army, the size of the army, its organisation, its discipline, its motivation, its paying conditions was not addressed, you would have a problem from the army. I mean, in effect, you had a very, very volatile situation. Large bodies of armed men, okay, ostensibly with differing ideologies and differing intentions. But nevertheless, with this fledgling government, you had a lot of people there whose interest was not in seeing them develop. And all those comments were made to the government. What they do with them is up to them. And they asked executive outcomes to leave. Executive outcomes left. And I would add that it was said as a sort of conclusion to our advice that within 100 days of executive outcomes leaving, if the RUF had not been defeated or some form of solution had been found to this army problem and their rivalry with the Kamajos, there would be trouble in the country. And in fact, it happened on the 95th day.
But I mean,
So sorry, to go back to your question, which was, well, executive outcomes didn't solve the problem. They could have done, but with all business of companies like Sandline and executive outcomes, the choice is the government or the military command of the country, of the client country. It's not our choice, and we have to abide by their decisions.
I understand that, but of course, what the president of Sierra Leone said to me anyway when I talked to him about this, was that the cost of this was, absolutely crippling to his economy. I mean, so it may well be that it was working, but working at an enormous cost, which actually meant, he didn't have money to spend on, on more important social spending.
I mean, it is an expensive business to run a military campaign, and if you're running it trying to apply military force in the way that should be applied, with minimum force to achieve maximum effect, you have to use technology, and running helicopters and providing equipment, munitions, manpower is an expensive business. And I suppose it comes down to a stark choice. If you can't do it yourself and you have to employ consultants in the same way that you would in the oil business or specific medical consultants or construction engineers or whatever, if you have to employ expatriate people to help you, it's expensive, but the choice is it's that or chaos in your country. I mean, it would have been, to me, the achievement of a democratic government in Sierra Leone was a real light in the tunnel in Africa generally, which has got any number of problems. And for it to be able to grow and develop, it needed a secure environment in which to develop other things. And it has to come down to whether you want security or not. If you don't have security, you don't attract foreign investment, your economy doesn't, and your economy and your infrastructure doesn't develop, and therefore you can't progress. And it may be a tough choice in the short term to spend money on the military and security as opposed to roads, schools, houses, etc. But you won't have those roads, schools and houses unless you have a secure environment.
Yeah, but isn't this something that should be provided by international organisations like the United Nations rather than profit-seeking businesses?
I don't think that is necessarily true. I don't think that countries can expect just to have handouts from organisations like the UN. I think the UN has a role to play, but I think that it's very clear that investment, private business and business development also has a role to play, and they should work in parallel. And I think, and if you look at various statements made by the American government recently, the whole thrust of their aid program is to try to get countries to help themselves by encouraging investment and allowing private concerns to assist, not necessarily to replace national aid or UN aid, but to take the burden off those organisations and countries because of this attitude, well, they should pay. It should be developed on a parallel track, and I think it's perfectly right and proper that business should assist with that regeneration and development of countries in which they're operating. I think it's perfectly reasonable.
One of the things that you said, I think both in writing and to the PNG inquiry, was that you only work for sovereign governments and you wouldn't, I think specifically said this, do anything that was not in accordance with the interests of the British government. What did you mean by that?
Well, I think what we mean is that, we do not wish to interfere with what I would call, the sort of foreign policy, the general thrust of foreign policy of Western governments, because in general, we are supportive of their efforts. We also have to live here. We work here. We all like to. We're UK citizens, a lot of us, and it would be ridiculous to try and cut across that sort of thing. And we are a small commercial organisation. We don't want to interfere in things like that.
But in fact, in the PNG case, when the minister discovered what was going on, the first thing he did was call in the PNG ambassador here and say, this has got to stop. So this looks as though this was something that didn't accord with the government's policy.
I don't know what actually took place. You're talking about the Foreign Secretary,
Yeah, well, it was actually the junior foreign minister,
okay.
yeah.
I don't know what took place in the Foreign Office. I was otherwise engaged. But I think that, as I understand it, what was said by the British government is that their policy direction was one of solving Bougainville. I don't think they were at all directly involved in it or particularly concerned about it. I think there were other priorities. But in general, the previous government and this government's general foreign policy principle is to try and resolve conflict peacefully. And I suppose to that end it did cut across that. But on the other hand, this was a situation that had been trying to be resolved one way or another for 9 years. And actually our intention, which I think I alluded to earlier, was not necessarily to go and fight a war there, but to create the conditions where these guys thought, enough is enough, let's talk. And I think that does not necessarily cut across foreign policy principles of this country or other key nations, if you can force a negotiated settlement by the implication that if this is not resolved peacefully, it may have to be resolved militarily. And subsequently, you have to reinforce that attitude with what I would call correct application of military force. Then, if you achieve a peaceful solution, then I think that in those circumstances, the sort of thing that we had in mind was useful, and I don't think it cuts across that sort of...
Except in this instance, that clearly the minister did not think it was useful. Jeremy Hanley immediately called, a very unusual thing, he calls the High Commissioner across and says, this has got to stop, this is not the way to go about this, and the aid that we give your country will be at risk if you do it. I mean, can't see how that could be construed as...
Well, again, I don't know what took place, and I wouldn't really wish to comment on what was said and not said in that particular instance. I mean, I've given you my explanation as to how we view that.
During the sort of 10 months or so in which these negotiations were taking place, did you keep the British government or any of its agencies informed of what you were doing?
No, we have no reason to do that. It was not part of our arrangement. It's a commercial arrangement with a client government, and we have to, as long as we think what we're doing is right, we have to maintain the client confidentiality.
It's a reasonable assumption for someone from outside that the British, say the British intelligence services knew perfectly well what you were up to, because you were making no secret of it. You were flying on scheduled airlines, using open phones, etc., etc. So, certainly from the outside, it looks as though they must have known what you were up to all along, didn't they?
I don't know. I mean, I have no way of knowing.
You've worked in the army nearly all your life. I mean, you know how these things work better than I.
I mean, I have no reason to suppose they either knew or they didn't know. I mean, it depends what direction their interest is taking in a particular moment in time. I mean, I have no way of knowing whether they knew what we were up to or not.
But you would expect them to know, wouldn't you?
I have no way of knowing. I mean, I can't comment. I don't work for the British Intelligence Service. I can't, put words in their mouth or say what they would and wouldn't do.
No, I understand that, but I mean, I suppose that, to the sort of curious lay observer, it just looks as though if they disapproved of what you were doing, they'd have come and said to you, look, for heaven's sake, this is not the appropriate thing to be doing. So then essentially...
I think you'd have to ask them that question.
Yeah, but you would expect that, wouldn't you, if they did disapprove, that you'd hear from them?
I have no idea what they would do or not do in a given set of circumstances.
Can I just take you back to one thing sorry, yes. So we just anyway, I know time is pressing, so let me. I want to obviously ask you, what you think the future for your sort of business is, but can I just sort of just take you back to one thing I forgot to ask you about Hong Kong. I mean, about the PNG contract. What on earth was going on at this meeting in Hong Kong between the 13th and 15th of February, where all of the people from PNG and you and Michael Brumberg and Buckingham turn up, according to Andrews, and he can't get to the bottom of what was being talked about.
I mean, as far as I remember, it was very clear. We discussed the whole Sandline project, the way in which it was developing. I mean, it had started and was running, and I think that they were. The government was, I'm looking for the right word, anxious rather than nervous about, is it going to work? We've never done this before. And we gave them we had a detailed discussion about that. I mean, those are the only discussions I took part in.
And what is this McGowan briefing paper about the shareholding in the Bougainville?
I've no idea. You'd have to ask.
I mean, you've got a copy of it.
McGowan. Yeah, but you'd have to.
But why was it raised? I mean, obviously you can see the conclusion Andrew draws. So there was some discussion there in some way about the takeover of this.
I was really only interested in, as the project leader, if you like, the project officer, or whatever you want to call it, in the development of this military project with the government and coming up with the right solution. At that meeting, training was going on. The trainers were there. The equipment was en route. And I really wanted to make sure that what we were doing is what they wanted us to do, and that they were happy with the way things were going. It just happened to be that I was going home through Hong Kong. They were there. Any other discussion that may or may not have taken place between ministers and Rupert McGowan or other people at Jardines, I can't comment on.
So, and just before we leave this completely, you did once say at some stage in your evidence that you had some share options in Diamond Works. Mm-hmm. Right? The only share option scheme Diamond Works has is an employee share option scheme, so does that, you can take it you are an employee?
No, I'm not. And I can tell you why I had those. At one stage, I was going to be taken on by Diamond Works as a security consultant for all their properties around the world. And to be frank, I had too much to do. And it was not a sensible decision when we were developing Sandline to be focused on a particular company that has quite a lot of wide-ranging holdings in difficult and dangerous places, to focus my attention on commercial security and do them a decent job as a consultant when I should have been developing Sandline and concentrating on the military side of the business. And therefore those options were never taken up. The whole thing lapsed.
Now, you are as aware as I am that the operations of both your company and of Executive Outcomes has been the subject of a considerable amount of controversy. I mean, even raised the United Nations, last week when it was discussed. And it does look as though perhaps the future for this sort of operation is not quite as bright as you felt it was, say 12 months or so ago.
I think I'm not aware. I mean, you've asked us about what happened 2 weeks ago at the United Nations. We haven't seen any of this. We're aware of the report that was made in February, quite an extensive submission. But I don't necessarily agree with you. If you look at the case of Executive Outcomes, and obviously I've said to you I don't work for them, but I'm just looking at that as an example, you will be aware that there's been quite a lot of discussion about new legislation in South Africa to control the activities of people who are in the security business or the military support and supply business. That legislation is developing slowly. Executive Outcomes have been invited to become part of the debate about how that works, and I know that their senior personnel have addressed the South African Parliament on a number of occasions and are in detailed discussion with the ministers involved. Last week, they were registered as a proper supplier of these services under the current legislation, but there's no reason to suppose that that registration won't move into the new legislation. So I think that, in my view, that's a healthy thing, because, if you like, it gives them a tick in the box from the government and it allows them to conduct their business providing that they fulfil the criteria that the South African government have laid down for taking up these contracts. And therefore, I think that they will continue to flourish. In the case of Sandline, there is no legislation here at the moment that is any different than has always been the case about this sort of type of business. And as long as we stick to our operating principles and behave ourselves properly and only work for legitimate governments, then and don't get involved in any dodgy business in whatever angle you put on that, then I think that we will continue to develop, given that the world is an extremely dangerous and volatile place, more so than it was, in my view, 10 years ago. And there are countries that need to solve problems which may or may not involve the use of military skills, either in the training field or the development of their armed forces, or the creation of armed forces that will support the government without going off on their own track, or resolving conflict internally, because we won't get involved in cross-border operations. And I can see that in the short and medium term, there will be a continuing role. We're trying to develop our peace support operations sphere as well, mine clearing, logistics support, support to agencies such as the UN, and we would like to develop our relationship with NGOs, not non-governmental organisations, because we feel that they do a very valid job and they go out and operate in dangerous environments, and it is becoming increasingly clear that they are just as much targets as anybody else.
But I guess you say you don't know what's in the United Nations. One of the concerns, a number of concerns that Ballesteros had, and one of the concerns was that in certainly 3 of the cases that he looked at, which are the 3 high-profile cases we've all heard of, Angola, Sierra Leone and Papua New Guinea, the military services that you were offering seemed in some way to be tied up with the exploitation of those countries' mineral rights, and that exploitation was not necessarily on the best terms for those countries.
I go back to what I said before. I mean, this is a really old chestnut, this linkage between the provision of military services and the acquisition of mineral concessions. And I've given you my answer. I think it's nonsense, personally. Except in that, as I've explained, in my view, it is valuable for countries to be able to develop their infrastructure and their economy, and therefore their governmental revenue, to put to whatever purpose they choose. It's not our business to decide what they spend their money on. And in foreign investment, whether it's in the mineral field or whatever, or construction business, in my view, is healthy.
But in those instances, those few cases, it is the case, isn't it, that actually it has come as a package. The person who's introduced EO to those governments has also had an interest, and then
it hasn't come as a package. I mean, what I said before was there are a number of separate issues there. It has not come as a package.
Now, his other concern, Ballesteros' other concern, is that you are essentially a mercenary army. I mean, that is the position. You are people of a different nation fighting on the soil of another country, and the fact that you're engaged by the government is really neither here nor there. That you are a mercenary army, and therefore in breach of the conventions that cover the operation that prevent mercenary armies operating.
I don't think so, because if you look at those carefully, it says if they're not part of the armed forces of the country concerned, and we are always very careful to integrate ourselves into the armed forces or police or paramilitary units of the client government in order to demonstrate that we are there to help them and they lead on these projects, and to try and avoid this complicated issue. I mean, I don't personally have any difficulty with the word mercenary. I just don't like the image that it conjures up in most people's minds, and I think that Mr. Ballesteros is playing on that and trying to give companies like Sandline and Executive Outcomes the image that we don't have, or our track record shows that we don't have.
You say that you don't get involved in cross-border activities, but presumably your recent talks with the exiled government of Sierra Leone about helping them regain power would have led to a cross-border activity, wouldn't it?
I don't know which particular talks you're referring to.
They're widely reported in the Canadian press, weren't they? Which I'm sure you've read. But
the report in the Canadian press related to a report I was asked to write for an individual who wanted an assessment of what was likely to happen in Sierra Leone.
But I mean, that would have involved a cross-border activity, wouldn't it?
Hypothetically, if one was to support the exiled government of Sierra Leone, and indeed all these cases have got to be looked at in their on their individual merits, I would see absolutely nothing wrong in helping put back a democratic government that had been ousted by a combination of military coup and rebel activity. I wouldn't have a difficulty with that at all.
But I mean, that's where sort of one gets into different territory, isn't it? It's one thing just
I think that if you look at our operating principles, they're very clear. We will only work, the primary one is we'll only work for established governments, preferably democratically elected, but we're pragmatic enough to realise that they're few and far between. And if the government that we were assisting was ousted and they were deemed to be by the international community the legitimate government of the country, I think that nobody would argue that we'd have to back off because they happen to be outside the country. They want to get back into the country that they rightfully govern. That is different than supporting a rebel regime operating in one country into another country. It's a completely different case.
And the other concern, finally, because I know time is short, the other concern is that actually what an army of your sort becomes is an uncontrolled army within the country in which it operates. When you have, as clearly was the case in Sierra Leone, all of the advantages, the military advantages, the hardware advantages, the skill advantages, really it is extraordinarily difficult for the national government to be able to control you. And that's the great danger about all of this, that there become more powerful armies that operate in these countries than their own national army.
I think, I obviously understand people's concern about that. I can see that people would worry about that sort of thing. But we go out of our way, as I've just said, to try and integrate ourselves and be very clear, both with the government and the military, that we are there to support them. The decisions are theirs, the campaign planning is theirs, we will advise. But what we do desperately try and avoid is becoming a third force in a country and fall prey to the criticism that you've just raised.
Fine, thanks very much. Thank you. Thank you very much indeed.